Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. And we are going over, in this video, The Buddhist Concept of Self by Thomas Kasulis and A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume. And in our book, Hume's article follows right after this Buddhist concept of a self because Hume's philosophy is so very similar to the Buddhist argument against the existence of an eternal, enduring personal self, which the Hindus called atman. So Buddhist philosophy was anatman, no atman. Like you have theists and atheists, no God. So for Buddhism, there's no individual enduring self, there's no supreme enduring self of the universe or God, otherwise known as Vishnu, according to the Hindus. All there is what you actually experience, which is a series of sense impressions and emotions and ideas that constantly flow. And it's that pattern of constantly changing sense impressions and ideas that we call a self. So says Thomas Kasulis' interpretation of Buddha. As with Hinduism, there are varying schools of Buddhism. There's Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, the two big schools, and there's variations within them. There's one popular form of Buddhism, Amida Buddhism, and I encountered some advocates of that school of Buddhism at the University of Hawaii, and that's where I first learned, they believe in something very similar to what the Vaishnavas, the Vishnu worshippers of Hinduism, believe, and that is that you can live in another perfect planet when you die if you've developed certain levels of self-realization. So it just seemed, where's the anatman in that? And that's the whole philosophy of bodhisattvas, who refuse to let go of their individuality until they've helped other souls have liberation. So at any rate, in this text, there's no mention of other perfect pure lands for your Buddhahood self to populate. It's just very similar to David Hume, which is like, I don't see a self, there's no self. There's a instinctive human desire that we have a self, but that's all that it really is. Okay, so with that very loose background, I'll start reading from Kasulis' article, and I'll bring in issues we went over in the previous video, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and Joel Kupperman's interpretation of that, which was very much according to Shankara's impersonalistic school. So actually, for our exam, this is exam 3, so this video is helping us answer questions for part B. Question 6, explain the differences between Hindu and Buddhist views of the self. So I talked about these different schools of Hinduism. When you choose to explain Shankara's school of Hinduism, well, that's been accused by other Hindus of basically being Buddhism. So what's the difference? There is even with Shankara's idea that the Atman is not an eternal person and that the goal is to merge Atman into Brahman. Even with that, the idea that there's this other side of reality, Brahman, that's eternal and unchangeable, that apparently, at least according to Thomas Kasulis, is the essential difference between Buddhism and Hinduism. Hinduism does believe in some eternal, unchanging realm. They call it Brahman. Other schools of Hinduism say yes, and Atman is also eternal and unchanging, and I talked about how that is defended. But at any rate, they both agree Brahman is unchanging, whereas the Buddhists say there is nothing eternal and unchanging. Everything is a process, and when you let go of this instinct to cling on to something that's transcendental and unchanging, then you'll be free from all your anxieties, because you won't your artificial desires won't be frustrated anymore, because you will have overcome those desires by seeing that they're not based on anything real. Okay. Oh, this will also help with discussion 5, which is found in Learning Module 7. So there's 2 options. There are multiple views in part 4a. Which of these do you think presents the best explanation of the relation between mind and body? And the other one is, look at part B, which has the most interesting approach to the nature of the self. So part 4 of the book has subsections A, B, C, and D. Section A is mind and body, the mind and body problem. Section B is the self. We went over the Hindu concept of self. Now we're going over the Buddhist concept of self. So for discussion 5, you pick one of the readings from either part A or part B. You don't have to do both. You choose one or the other. So let me now get to this reading, and let's see here. Page 147, The Buddhist Concept of Self, Thomas Kasulis. His book was published in 1997, The Buddhist Concept of Self. So on the left-hand column, I'm going to start about halfway down. At around the time of the Buddha, however, a tradition of Indian thought that can be loosely identified as Hindu was already well underway and can be seen in sections of some later Vedas and especially the early Upanishads. As the Hindu philosophers sharpened their own skills and became more systematic in their rationales, the Buddha's followers found themselves in philosophical competition with not only a set of indigenous beliefs, but increasingly also with sophisticated analyses supporting those beliefs. The issue of personhood and its nature turned out to be a key point of contention. No idea in Hinduism was more central and had more philosophical luster than atman, which could mean simply self, but in Hindu thought typically added the connotations of true self or soul. In fact, some early Hindu texts identified the true self with the oneness of reality, Brahman. So I'm just going to read this another couple of sentences. Buddhism, on the other hand, explicitly took the position of denying the reality of such a self. The Buddha himself made anatman, the negation of atman, an emblem of his break from the Hindu tradition around him. Okay. So the Hindus believe in Atman, an unchanging self underlying all of your changing emotions and sense perceptions, an eternal soul. And the flip side of the soul is Brahman, the monistic, impersonal, all-encompassing potential of being. So Atman and Brahman. And the phrase that Joel Kupperman talked about in his analysis of Hinduism was, Atman is Brahman. And he took Shankara, the 9th century commentator of the Upanishads and the Vedanta philosophy. He took his interpretation of Atman as Brahman, meaning Atman should merge into Brahman like a lump of salt dissolves into the ocean of infinite consciousness. But it's not consciousness of any object. It's just pure objectless, subjectless consciousness, impersonal. You can't even really call it consciousness. It's a word for that which is beyond cognitive comprehension. So, and I said, oh, how do you understand this Atman Brahman idea of what a self is, or the cosmos is, or the relation between the two is? The particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics is very helpful. The two-slit experiment revealed that when you observe these little particles, they act like little ball bearings, little enduring units. But when you're not observing them, they act as these waves of probability for where a particle might appear were you to observe it. Most likely at the peak or at the trough of the wave. So these are two mutually exclusive but complementary ways of observing the same thing. And the way Shankar interprets the Atman is it's an illusion. It should be merged into Brahman. subsequent commentators said, why are you interpreting the Upanishads that way? They do say things like that Atman is like a lump of salt that merges into Brahman, but on the other hand, they talk about this, like lovers, and this is the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's like lovers embracing each other. That's the kind of a unity. There's two people, but they forget the differentiations between themselves and between the inner and the outer world. So it's easier to differentiate Hinduism from Buddhism if you say that the Atman is also eternal individual self, which Ramanuja, Madhava, and Chaitanya, following Shankara, said throughout the Middle Ages of Europe and India. And Chaitanya's ultimate conclusion was Achintya Beda Beda Tattva, that the Atman, or the Supreme Atman, is inconceivably simultaneously one with and different from everything. So everything is Brahman, but simultaneously everything is Atman. Atman doesn't dissolve. These are two mutually exclusive perceptions of the same thing. You don't perceive Brahman. Brahman is that which exists without being perceived, what Kant would call the thing in itself. Okay, so I'm bringing that up because we've been going over Hume and Kant, and we're going to be going over Hume in a second here. But continuing on page 147 with Thomas Kasulis, I don't know how to pronounce it, Kasulis. I'm saying Kasulis. I'll just say Kasulis. In developing an understanding of Buddhist philosophical views in relation to personhood, it is useful to bear in mind two general principles behind Buddhist thought. First, Buddhist philosophy arises out of Buddhist praxis or activity. Of course, one could claim that there's always connection between theory and praxis. All right, then he gives an example. Sometimes theory precedes the practice, and sometimes practice precedes the theory. In science, you come up with a theory, and then you produce a laboratory experiment to try to reproduce your prediction based on your theory. So the theory comes first, and then you build the practice of the empirical test. But, for example, the practice of learning and using language precedes the subsequent development of linguistic theory about language acquisition. You want to study language? Okay, that's interesting, but you learned language from your infancy, so that the practice of learning language preceded any theory you could have ever had about how to do it. So he says, Thomas Kasulis says that Buddha began with practice and then developed the theory afterwards. In an analogous fashion, as we shall see, this is page 148 on the left, Buddhist philosophies about the self tend to arise out of meta-practical reflection rather than prior theoretical systematization. This point about the priority of praxis has clear philosophical implications. For example, Buddhism generally shies away from speculative metaphysics and argumentation about cosmic realities. It is typically less interested in analyzing reality to increase our understanding of it, and more interested in probing and eliminating our resistance to accepting realities that, at least on some level, we already recognize. Okay, so they're less interested in understanding the cosmos and more interested in eliminating our attachments to our false understandings of it. So you'd say, well, how do you know your understanding of it is false if you don't analyze it? So they do analyze what it is, but the reason that they are doing that is not to understand every detail of what the cosmos is made of or how it interacts, but only so far as it is helpful in breaking this attachment to these false conceptions of what we actually perceive, according to the Buddhists. So continuing here, for example, what we ordinarily experience is impermanent and not eternal. Buddhism's inclination is to examine our flight from accepting the apparent fact that our quest to try to access some other reality transcendent to our ordinary sense experience. Why do we do that? Why do we want to fly away from what we're actually experiencing, which is a world of temporary, ever-changing experiences? To put this in terms more familiar to the contemporary West, Buddhism is more interested in the psychological than in the metaphysical aspects of philosophical reflection. Right. So here's, I mean, I actually am reading more of this than I normally would because each paragraph has some important philosophical points. So let me just read quickly here through some. I'm skipping a sentence or two here and there. So any philosophical position ultimately makes some initial assumptions within which it then develops its case. There's one premise that Buddhism does take as an unprovable starting point, namely that there is a real presence besides the workings of the mind, and that the presence does not disguise itself to our ordinary ways of knowing. Again, using a Western terminology that offers only a rough fit, we can say that Buddhism is foundationally realist rather than, say, idealist or even constructivist. All right, there is a real presence. So this is going to bring up the issue of Maya, the Hindu concept of Maya, illusion. Is there some transcendental, eternal, unchanging essence underlying our experience of this ever-changing phenomenal world? The Buddhists say, no, this isn't an illusion. You see what you actually experience, but then you have these diluted projections onto your actual experience that are based on these hankerings for continuity and permanence and to possess something, and I am me and I want to have that and I don't want it to dissolve. That's what the Buddhists will say. The Hindus will agree to a degree. They'll say, yes, this false identification of the atman with the material body does lead to the delusion that these material things are permanent and we can hold on to them. But the theistic schools of Hinduism, which are more popular, I don't know why they would choose this atheistic school of Hinduism to compare to Buddhism, but at any rate, they'd say, but there are eternal forms in the spiritual world, and you do have an eternal personality in some eternal spiritual form, surrounded by an eternal ecosystem of other eternal spiritual forms, which is, as I mentioned earlier, similar to Amida Buddhism. So, but the Buddha's saying, no, there's no such thing. That's just a fiction. And when you fill your mind with those hankerings after those kinds of fantasies, you're just going to fill yourself with anxiety. To get rid of anxiety, just accept what you actually experience and don't hope for anything other than reality as it presents itself to you, and then you'll be free from all of these attachments, which are the source of all your misery. So continuing on page 148, in discussing phenomenal appearance, it is important to add one further point about the general Indian context. So general Indian context means Hinduism and Buddhism, and as Jainism is another Indian religion. In Buddhism, as in most other Indian philosophical systems, the ordinary sensory experience, in quotation marks, to which we have referred are products of 6, not 5 senses. All right, so you've got 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. The other one is the introspective sense. It's as if we can look within the inner eye. Oh, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? So that's a 6th sense. Hindus and Buddhists say there's 6 senses. The mind is a subtle material element, and so there's a sense organ responsible for perceiving it. Now, what is the organ? We have a nose to smell with, eyes to see with. What's the sense organ for the inner perception? I know Rene Descartes thought it was the pineal gland, which a lot of people on the internet identify with the third eye, the Anjana chakra, some chakra in the 7 chakras of this esoteric Hindu system of the subtle material circulatory system. But at any rate, 6 senses and an inner awareness. And this is important philosophically for whether or not there is a self, because, and I'm just going to preface it here now, as we'll see, Kant criticizing David Hume. So Hume took this inner 6th sense and he says, I'm looking in at my mind, and do I experience any enduring, unchanging self? No, I experience sight, smells, feelings of hatred, feelings of love, all these ever-changing emotions and sense perceptions in this extremely rapid flux, but I don't perceive any enduring self underneath of all of that. And that's what Buddha said as well. Where's the self? And so Kant would say, yes, that sixth sense, that inner introspective, that will not give you knowledge of the self. What Kant called it, he called it empirical apperception. Empiricism, knowledge comes from the sense organs. Well, there's a sixth sense, the inner introspective sense, but that's also empirical. It's just you perceive what's actually happening. And with none of the six senses can you ever detect a self. Kant would say yes, but there's another form of introspection, which he called transcendental apperception. And it's simply using logic to infer from, all right, what am I actually experiencing? A flux of sense perceptions and emotions and ideas. When I carefully analyze them, I see that they're unconnected by any empirically observable link. And yet, when I don't analyze them so acutely, what do I actually experience? My mind perceives enduring physical objects. I see an apple, not a flux of photons and electrons and protons, and I see furthermore all of these other objects. I don't see a flux of discrete, unconnected sense impressions. I see a world filled with enduring objects that interact with each other according to laws of nature that are predictable and repeatable. How is that possible? How could such an orderly world of appearance emerge from what I'm actually experiencing, as David Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumber to see, is that there's just these unconnected sense impressions. How did those unconnected sense impressions become such an orderly world of enduring objects that we perceive? There must be some underlying unifying agent that's responsible for all of that. The order in the universe that we perceive, the nature of physical objects interacting according to fixed laws of nature, that's not out there. That's not part of the thing in itself, which we can never know, because what that world of nature we perceive is that thing in itself after it's been categorized by our inborn a priori categories of thought, such as space and time and substance and self, the ultimate unifying category of thought. That we wouldn't experience anything but a chaos of sense perceptions and ideas that aren't connected in any meaningful way, unless there was some organizing entity which you cannot perceive empirically with any of your six senses, the five bodily ones and the sixth mental empirical observation capacity that we have. But you can use your reason to infer there must be something. We don't just accidentally form the habit of developing these mathematically precise laws of nature. That's something that happens automatically. We do project these ordering principles onto the universe, but we do it automatically. It's a fixed, objective fact of the nature of the self. And it's what the Hindus call Maya. And this is an important distinction between Buddhism and Hinduism, because the Buddhists say it's not Maya, it's not an illusion. Rather, it's a delusion. It's a psychological delusion that you project this world of continuing objects that you can possess onto what you're actually experiencing, which is this ever-flowing process. Now, one point I will point out when I read David Hume is that David Hume says there's no connection between these sense perceptions. In Thomas Kasulis' interpretation of Buddhism, he'll talk about the self is a process. It's an ongoing and ever-changing process. But a process implies links of cause and effect, and he even uses the word these linked changes and related psychological processes. Hume would say there's no process or linkage, there's just unconnected chaos, and all of the links of cause and effect that we perceive are fictions that we use, and they help us survive in our bodily life. And he says, I don't know why we do it that way, but it's just a habit that we have developed and we foist upon the world that we actually experience. There's no process, it's just a flux. The Buddhists will say there are processes, and the self is the nexus that links all these processes. So there's a point of potential difference between the Buddhist philosophy and David Hume. All right, so I've given an overview of that. We just went over here, page 148, right-hand column, about the 6 senses, inner awareness or introspection. From the Buddhist standpoint, that I feel hungry or embarrassed, for example, are as empirical and objective as that I see color, as that I see the color red or hear a thud. Introspection is not considered a different order of knowing from extrospection. That's perceiving things with your 5 outward sense organs. So introspection, all right, the acceptance of the reality and objective accessibility of psychological states is important to the Buddhist praxis as the foundation for its understanding of self. So Kant would say, okay, then the foundation of your understanding of self is empirical apperception, which was the same foundation for David Hume's understanding of the self. Just simply look inward, observe what's happening in your mind. You will not perceive the self. According to tradition, the Buddha developed his distinctive forms of praxis in response to a pervasive sense of anguish, anxiety, or unsatisfactoriness, dukkha. Through a series of meditations that allowed him to cease making conceptual constructions, he introspectively focused on the stream of immediately available psychological events. That's what David Hume does. He concluded that what we directly experience is what actually is, and that anguish arises from our refusal to accept what exists for what it is. Ordinarily, he claimed, we project onto the immediately accessible phenomena a desire for things to be otherwise, to be mine rather than simply to be enduring instead of transient, to be substantial, to be independently existing entities instead of interdependent processes. Through the meditative praxis, the Buddha was purportedly able to disengage those projections. In so doing, he was able to gain the insight that allowed him not to form the fixations or attachments that lead to our ordinary sense of ego, substantiality, permanence, and self-dependency. In other words, the fruits of the praxis carried over into his ordinary life by liberating him from the tendency to structure his experiences around those categories. So these are the categories, the a priori categories of thought that Kant talked about. Freed of their effects, he was said to be able to accept things for what they are. The anguish disappeared. So then we'll talk a little bit about Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree, where he remembered all of his past lives and then even all of the past lives of everyone in the universe. But first, let's go over what we just read. So he was able to free himself from the tendency to categorize all of his experiences according to the concepts of enduring substance, and including the idea of an enduring self. And that's what David Hume is going to do. Okay, so what are the categories? Well, according to Immanuel Kant, these categories, they're not just mental habits that people have formed. You're born with them. They're objective facts. They're space, time, causality, the idea of substance, and also self, which he calls transcendental apperception. Again, that when you think about it, is it really possible that all of this world of enduring objects in space and time that are connected with each other by these laws of cause and effect, is that really something that we could have just randomly started? Some human beings just started, hey, oh, look, there's an unconnected flux of sense perceptions, emotions, and ideas. Well, why don't we start to categorize this random flux in certain ways? Oh, yeah, let's say that this random flux of photons and protons and electrons is an apple, and this, the habit would never get started unless it was done for us automatically. And if it was done for us automatically, then there must be some thing doing that. And that thing that's doing that is the self. You cannot perceive it empirically, either outwardly or inwardly, through introspection, but you can use reason to realize that there must be something ordering the world in this very orderly way that's mathematically predictable, says Kant, because it wouldn't just emerge. So it's true that things aren't these enduring objects, but the tendency to interpret them that way is an enduring fact of the human psyche. So Kant said, well, we'll never know what the thing in itself outside of our sense perceptions is, because we can only perceive it after it's been categorized for us by these lenses of cognition. The Hindus would say, well, let me tell you, that which you are perceiving is just another aspect of you, the perceiver. At one fundamental level, Atman is Brahman. Atman, the subjective observer of the universe, is one with that which is being observed. All right, so I'm going to continue here. The left-hand column, 148 at the bottom. The story of Buddha's awakening, Buddha means awakened one, is peppered with various accounts of his achieving supernormal or paranormal powers. The ability to remember previous lifetimes, for example. It is significant, however, that none of those powers were considered necessary for underpinning his account of reality and of the self. To duplicate the Buddha's insight, one need not add something to what one ordinarily experiences. On the contrary, the Buddhist praxis is aimed at disengaging the conditioned responses that lead one to think things are other than they are. The praxis is a therapy that eliminates delusional, anxiety-provoking behaviors or constructions of reality. All right, well, what kind of powers did the Buddha experience according to the Buddhist tradition? Well, according to the Buddha Charita, the Acts of the Buddha, one of the famous Buddhist texts, he went through various stages of enlightenment. He sat under a fig tree, the Bodhi tree, and he achieved different stages of realization. I think there was 8, and I'll just read a little bit here. This is from the book that Anthology of World Religions. This is the religion book that we use. So in the first watch of the night, he recollected the successive series of his former births. There was I, so and so. That was my name. Deceased from there, I came here. In this way, he remembered thousands of births as though living them over again. When he had recalled his own births and deaths and all these various lives of his, the sage, full of pity, turned his compassionate mind towards other living beings, and he thought to himself again and again, they must leave the people they regard as their own and must go on elsewhere, and that without ever stopping. Surely this world is unprotected and helpless, and like a wheel it turns round and round. In the second watch, he achieved the heavenly eye, and he realized that beset on all sides, creatures can find no resting place. In this way, he surveyed the 5 places of rebirth with his heavenly eye, and he found nothing substantial in the world of becoming, just as no core of heart wood is found in a plantain tree when its layers are peeled off one by one. So he achieved all of these different levels, and then when the great seer had comprehended that where there is no ignorance whatever, there also the karma formations are stopped, then he had achieved a correct knowledge of all there is to be known, and he stood out in the world as a Buddha. He passed through the 8 stages of transic insight and quickly reached their highest point. From the summit of the world downwards, he could detect no self anywhere. Like the fire, when its fuel is burnt up, he became tranquil. He had reached perfection, and he thought to himself, this is the authentic way on which in the past so many great seers who also knew all higher and lower things have traveled on to ultimate and real truth, and now I have obtained it. So at that point, the demigods showered flowers from the sky, and a host of invisible beings were observing this great momentous event, and pleasant breezes swept across the earth, and fruits dropped out of season, out of respect. And for 7 days he dwelt there. His body gave him no trouble, his eyes never closed, and he looked into his own mind. He thought, here I have found freedom. And he knew that the longings of his heart had at last come to fulfillment, now that he had grasped the principle of causation and finally convinced himself of the lack of self in all that is. He roused himself again from his deep trance, and in his great compassion he surveyed the world with his Buddha eye, intent on giving it peace. All right, then he said, you know what, maybe I'll just, since this is all, this is all not what it appears to be, and the whole point is to be detached, maybe I'll just let go of all attempts to do anything. But then the demigods Indra and Brahma said, please don't do that. Please come and help all these other suffering souls. They don't the idea is there's no eternal soul, but all these other suffering temporary delusions and whirlpools of karma that think that they're enduring, please help them realize that they're not enduring selves. So then Buddha says, okay, I'll stay and I'll help. And he spread his teachings. All right, so looking down from the summit of the world, though, that's interesting because that's a very common factor of world religions and near-death experiences. Or Buddha had this out-of-body trance experience. He rose to the summit of the world. The Prophet Muhammad had a dream where he did the same thing and experienced prophets at each of the spheres of sending from the central earth. Moses was the last one, and he told him, God is out at the outermost sphere, Allah. So they went back and forth. The Hindus say in the Katha Upanishad, Vishnu, he's out at that outermost sphere. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they talked about Akshara, the immortal one. On space is the past, present, and future interwoven. Akasha, that's the outermost sphere of the 5 spheres, earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And space, or Akasha, is interwoven on Akshara. There's this, the past, the present, and the future coexist at each point of this outermost sphere. That's where Vishnu is, the Supreme Self. And Vishnu is also in the center of every universe. We are all projections of Vishnu according to the theistic form of Vishnu-worshipping Hinduism. That's what Atman is. It's a fractal of the Supreme Atman. It exists at the central point of the universe and at each point of the encompassing sphere. In near-death experiences, like the one Carl Jung, the psychologist, had, many times people say, I felt my consciousness rise out of my body, hurtling through space until it reached a point of no return at the horizon of the cosmos, where I lived my entire life, flashed before my eyes. And not only that, a lot of people say I experienced everybody else's, the entire past, present, and future of the universe. And I'm mentioning all of this because even Buddha, during his enlightenment, went out there. But he said, looking down from there, I see no self anywhere. But from that summit, he could see, it seems to me, the past, the present, and the future. That perceiving of the past, the present, and the future, the world, the unchanging world, that's what you require for there to be a self, this unchanging unit of consciousness. And, oh, well, you could have no, personal biography because that's changing. But if each point of your biography is experienced simultaneously at the horizon of the cosmos, you could have the best of both worlds. And that is what a lot of these near-death experience accounts, including the Katha Upanishad, which is the near-death experience account of Nachiketa. That's what these texts say. So I'm bringing that up just because Buddha's own enlightenment experience supports this idea of the self being one with this outermost horizon where space and time are eternally preserved and occurring simultaneously. Okay, so continuing here, Thomas Kasulis is saying, but you don't need any of those out-of-body type of experiences. Just what you have in your everyday experience is enough to give you the enlightenment of a Buddha. Just realize there is no enduring self. There's no enduring anything. What you experience is what you get, a flux of different sense perceptions and ideas. So the continuing here on the left-hand column of page 149, the early Buddhist texts relate the Buddha's own hesitation to enter into analyses not conducive to breaking the patterns leading to delusion. For better or worse, however, Buddhism developed in India at a time when Hindu philosophical reflection, speculation, and analysis were beginning to blossom. The Buddhists found themselves being asked philosophical questions that could not be avoided. To understand Indian Buddhist philosophy, especially its analysis of the self as anatman, we need to appreciate the larger intellectual context of the time. Now, we have some of that from the previous video about Hinduism. In the Buddha's era, there was already an Indian trend toward distrusting the ordinary senses. It is significant, therefore, that Buddhist praxis worked against that tendency. The Hindu texts often refer to Maya, the idea that reality takes on an illusory mask that must be understood if its true nature is to be fathomed. According to this common Hindu view, reality does not appear to us the way it essentially is. What we see as multiplicity, evanescence, and distinctions may be, in fact, only the superficial appearance of a deeper transcendent reality of oneness and changeless Brahman. Okay, so there is the essential difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, even the atheistic forms of Hinduism, because even Shankara's atheistic form of Hinduism, which does not believe in an eternal personal atman, says there is Brahman, and that is changeless, this eternal, changeless unity. And so the Buddhists are saying, no, nothing is changeless, everything is constantly changing. That's also what David Hume says. So even though Shankara says, okay, Buddhists, I'll grant you, there is no eternal, enduring, personal, individual soul, but there is an eternal, unchanging, impersonal Brahman, which contains these illusions of personality within it, like the froth of an ocean. That's Shankara's interpretation, which was rejected by his successors, that there is an eternal, personal, subjective awareness, atman. All right, but continuing, therefore, with the proper knowledge, we may see, this is Thomas Kuhn's interpretation of Hinduism, we may still see the illusion, but also see through it to the reality beyond. This allows a detached, sometimes even playful engagement with the world, analogous to how we might find ourselves caught up in the illusion of a magic show or cinema. While enjoying the show, we also know that the distinctions with which we are engaged are illusions. All right, the cinema is a good metaphor because according to holographic string theory developed by the Stanford string theorist Leonard Susskind, who's an atheist, and his Nobel Prize-winning partner Gerard 't Hooft, I don't know what his philosophical leanings are, but they say that this three-dimensional world that we experience is an illusion. It's a cinematic hologram. That's Suskind's word, a holographic movie. That the holographic film is the cosmic horizon where space-time, from our perspective on Earth, is expanding away from us in every direction at the speed of light. Every bit of information describing the past, present, and future of the universe is conserved at each point out there. At the infinitely hot horizon of the cosmos, from our perspective, it's infinitely hot. And that information radiates back in to create the cinematic hologram on fundamental threads of energy, which are carried in with the incoming cosmic microwave background radiation, which is the echo of the Big Bang from the gravitational singularity, which is another part of this idea of atman. Atman is this, the gravitational singularity has a lot of the qualities attributed to the atman. It's an eternal point, literally an unextended point of infinite energy. Compact an infinite amount of energy into a point of zero volume, that's a gravitational singularity. It contains all space and time, and yet it's outside of space and time, very much like the atman concept of Hinduism. If there is such a thing as a gravitational singularity, that throws a big monkey wrench in the Buddhist philosophy that there is no enduring atman, and is for David Hume as well. I wrote a book, Psyche and Singularity, where I equate the psyche with the singularity, following Carl Jung's reflections about the nature of psychic energy. Why doesn't it have any mass? We can't measure it. Maybe we can't measure it because it has infinite mass. Psyche equals singularity. And the singularity includes this horizon of the cosmos. So the singularity contains all points of space and time, and the singularity is located at each point of its encompassing horizon. In this new cosmology developed by an atheist, I think, there's a lot of evidence for the Hindu view, which is similar to Plato's view. which was adopted by the Christians and the Jews as well, and the Muslims also, about this. The self is one with the universal self. The universal self is located at the central point of the spherical universe and at each point of the encompassing sphere, and that the illusion, Maya, of the three-dimensional world radiates in specifically on threads which Plato called threads of destiny in the near-death experience of the myth of Ur, the end of the Republic, and the Hindu text, the Brihadaranyaka, calls Akshara. Or Sutratman is another one, the thread soul. Sutra means thread, and Atman means soul. So, having mentioned that, continuing on 149, the right-hand column, Buddhism disagrees fundamentally with the Hindu viewpoint. In Buddhism, the issue to be addressed is not illusion, but delusion. According to Buddhism, we experience the unreal not because the real presents a false appearance, but because we project our own desires onto what is presented. All right, so the real isn't covering itself with a veil of Maya. We're projecting our own desires onto what's real. All right, but all you have to say is we do project our own desires, but we don't do it willfully. We automatically do it. And that automatic projection of our own desires is caused by is what the Hindus call Maya, this goddess whose job in existence is to make souls think they are these material bodies. Maya is equivalent to, says Friedrich Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy here, his first book, section 18, he says, Schopenhauer showed that the a priori categories of thought that Kant talked about, space, time, and causality in particular, those are what the Hindus call Maya. And it's not something we choose to do. We are under the illusory power of Maya. What is Maya? Well, some of the descriptions of Maya would include being the a priori categories of thought, space, time, causality, substance. And even though we are the ones projecting, we don't do it intentionally. So it's not a delusion. We are under the illusion, says the Hindus. So this is a good point to differentiate Hinduism from Buddhism with. If you look to the article by Joel Kupperman on page 138, he talks about this very same illusion-delusion distinction. On the right-hand column up at the top, so there is also the problem of the layers of individual personality that surround the Atman. According to the Upanishads, they are not the real you or any part of the real you. Are they then an illusion? They certainly are not a delusion. That is, they are not like introspective hallucinations that have no footing in the world as it really is. An illusion, as opposed to a delusion, is something that distorts a reality that is there, but in a different form from the one that you take it to have. In this sense, the Upanishads do hold that individual personality is an illusion. Nevertheless, it is an illusion that has an experiential life of its own. All right, so that's page 138. You could contrast that to what Thomas Kasulis is saying on 149. Buddhism disagrees fundamentally with the Hindu viewpoint. In Buddhism, the issue is to be addressed as not illusion, but delusion. According to Buddhism, we experience the unreal not because the real presents a false appearance, but because we project our own desires onto what is presented. Continuing here, a little lower down, the right-hand column, the phenomenal world is not illusion, Maya, but suchness or thusness, ta-ta-ta. This difference had a fundamental impact on the Atman-Anatman debate between Hindu and Buddhist philosophies of self. The general position developed in many Hindu Upanishads was that behind the sensory functions, there must be a faculty or agency possessing the function. If there is seeing or hearing, for example, there must be that which sees or hears. Yet whatever the seer or hearer is, it itself must be unseen or unheard, or there would be an infinite regress. We could endlessly ask, if the seer is itself seen, then what sees the seer? Therefore, argued this group of Hindu philosophers, there must be something that is the subject, but never the object, of human sensory experience, including introspection. It is the unseen, unheard, untasted, untouched, unsmelled, and unintrospected self behind a person's various experiences. It itself is unchanging and inaccessible to ordinary sensory knowing, yet it defines what one is. It is the atman, the true self. And as I've discussed already, that is equivalent to what Kant called transcendental apperception, that the illusions of the categories of thought, of space, time, causality, substance, and self, which is the root of all the other ones, of all the other categories of thought, the category of space and time and cause and effect and enduring substances, they must be rooted in some other background of being which can't be perceived directly, and that is the self. That's what the Hindus say, and that's what Kant also says. So Kant followed Hume, and Hume's a lot like the Buddhists. So in that respect, Kant is a lot like the commentators on the Upanishads who followed Shankara. That would be Ramanuja, Madhava, and Chaitanya, who they grant some of Shankara's points, but they say no, there is this enduring personal Atman. And that, again, becomes conceivable when all of the variegated experiences you might have, if they're eternally conserved at the horizon of the cosmos, then you can experience a personal self, each point of your biography simultaneously. That's one way to look at it, but the Hindus would say all of your personal life in your physical body is an illusion. Your eternal soul is not your physical body. So even if the memories of each point of your physical biography are eternal, still, that's not your eternal self. Your eternal self has some other relationship with Vishnu, says the Vishnu-worshipping Hindus. And you've got an eternal spiritual relationship with Vishnu and Lakshmi and whoever else you know in your, on the whatever Vishnu loka that you hail from. That's your true self. And this is a dream, kind of like a Mahavishnu goes to sleep, exhales all these bubble universes. So this is in effect the dream of Vishnu. And your true self is in the spiritual world. But even this material illusory biography, even that is not actually a fleeting phenomenon. It's eternally memorized in the memory bank of the universe itself. So there's a lot of avenues for discussion that we could go down, but let me continue here. Here's another point of the infinite regress. Oh, there must be some seer, because seeing is happening. And unless you want an infinite regress, you've got to say, oh, there's an Atman. But you can have an infinite regress and still believe in an Atman if you identify the Atman, as I do, with the gravitational singularity, which is an infinite regress of all space-time. Singularity is not a static thing. It's a point within which all infinity is constantly being sucked at an infinite rate. So you could identify Atman with an infinite regress. It is the infinite regress. So yet whatever the seer or hearer is, it itself must be unseen or unheard, or there would be an infinite regress. We could endlessly ask, if the seer is itself seen, then what sees the seer? Or you could just say that the seer is an infinite regress. You still wouldn't be able to see it. You can't see a singularity. It is an infinite regress. And I say it has all of the qualities of Atman if we granted consciousness. Okay, so continuing here, on the right-hand column of page 149, the gist of this Hindu argument already existed in the early Upanishads current at the time of the Buddha, and the details were further developed by subsequent philosophical analysis in the ensuing few centuries. It is important to point out, however, that the acceptance of Atman was not just the result of abstract reasoning. There was an experiential or practical component to the belief as well. For understanding the Hindu position, the central point is that what we mean by direct experiential knowledge, if we limit such knowledge to what is accessible to the six senses, then Atman's very definition excludes its verification. We need not limit direct experiential knowledge in that way. However, Yogic disciplines for controlling the mind and body were already highly developed in ancient India. They said they could stop all sense perceptions, even the sixth sense of introspection, and then they could experience just pure Atman awareness, no subject-object distinction. And then, okay, you can stop all of your five sense perceptions and your introspection and achieve this pure state of pure awareness, awareness of just awareness itself, with no dualistic differentiation between me being aware of something else. Okay, well, there's a philosophical problem with that. Then when that state of pure awareness stops and you come back to your ego awareness, are you the same ego you were before? Because there was a break. There wasn't a continuity between your ego, then you had the trance state, now your ego picks up again. That implies that there is, for Buddhists, it could imply that there is no self. I'm going to read what he says. One might question the possibility of such an event. For example, what continuity would there be between the trance state and the return to the normal consciousness? With no distinctions, who or what would emerge from such a state? And how would that be connected to the person who existed? So the Hindus say, that proves that there is an Atman. Because look, something must have carried the continuity on it in order for your ego projections to pick up again. If the trance state stopped it, they would have just dissolved. But the fact that they picked up where they left off means that they were contained and preserved in something, and that is Atman. Yet when we awake every morning, this is the same for dreamless sleep, we remember who we are and have been. To the proponents of the Atman theory, this was further evidence that personal identity resides in a level of reality not accessible to ordinary sensory experience. Okay. This justified, in their view, the identification of the true self Atman with monistic reality Brahman. So you go into a trance, all of your ego issues, they merge in Brahman, and then they come back when you remember again who you were. So there must be some continuity, some essence that continues things, some unchanging essence upon which changing things can be temporarily stored and then released again. At least in general form, it is that type of theory of Atman that the Buddha rejected in his position on Atman. Even in its earliest texts, Buddhism rejected both parts of the Hindu theory of Atman, namely the logical argument that actions require an independently existing agent. For there to be seeing, there must be a seer that is not itself seen. And two, the meta-practical argument that the possibility of having events of sensory succession implies there is a true self behind the experience. You can have trance-like experiences where you experience nothing, and then you come back after that. That proves there's a self behind the experience, because something was enabling your memories to continue even when they were temporarily shut down. So Buddha responds to those two parts of the Atman theory. The logical part, for every action there must be an actor, and the meta-practical argument, we go into trances and yet we maintain our individuality, so there must be some self upon which our individuality is imprinted. As we have seen in our discussion of Buddhist praxis, the Buddha maintained that what we experience through the senses, and therefore what really is a nexus of interconnected processes, not unchanging things, such as Atman. Buddhism insists that a process does not require an agent that undergoes the change. Ordinary language can be misleading. We say the river flows in its channel, but this does not mean that the river is something other than the continuing process of waters flowing in the channel. Similarly, nature does not cause or undergo the change of seasons. The changing of the seasons is one of the processes that constitutes nature. Nature isn't undergoing the autumn season right now. The autumn season is part of the process that we call nature. So the analogy to an idea of self is clear. I am not what has or undergoes the process of psychological change. Rather, those processes themselves constitute what is called I. There is an I, but it's an ever-changing process. It's an interrelated series of processes. According to traditional Buddhist thought, there are 5 interrelated processes constituting the self: the physical bodily form, sensations or feelings, sense perceptions, habitual mental formations or volitional tendencies, and consciousness. The self is therefore the name for the continuities and interactions among these five processes, and not something in addition to them. An implication of this theory is that the self is an activity, not a thing, and that its nature is to be the locus where the five processes intersect. On the page 151, up at the top of the left column, with this process image of the self, the various schools of Buddhist philosophy addressed in slightly different ways the issue of continuity. Common to all of them was the idea that the self is an ongoing interaction with other processes. Persons have an identity not because they contain some unchanging core, but precisely because they do change. The self is a pattern of the linked changes, each changing condition leading to reconfigurations that help set up the conditions for the next phase. The linked changes is what the self is. Now, there's an issue with David Hume. David Hume says we only imagine links between our sense perceptions. So there's not even a link. There's no real process for Hume. There's only a flux. The Buddhists are giving this flux another level of reality that, or another level of interconnectedness that Hume won't even grant. But continuing here, the Buddhist critique undercuts the Hindu argument for atman as the true self or the unseen seer. If seeing, for example, is a psychological process, there does not have to be some self or seer behind the process. The interrelated psychophysical processes themselves are what we call I. Okay. A little bit lower there, just like a river is just a word that we use for a continuously changing process, so too does the Buddhist rest content with the characterization of the self as the name for a set of interrelated psychophysical processes. So that was addressing the first argument for Atman, the logical argument that every action has to have an actor behind it. Now the second one, the metapractical argument about trance states, that we continue to exist even after a trance. So if all we are is this psychological process, and those psychological processes can be suspended in a trance state, then how can they start up again after that and we are the same psychological process as before? It implies that that succession of psychological processes was stored somewhere temporarily, and that it must have been stored in something that's permanent. So there must be an Atman, which is one with Brahman. So Buddha rejected that, and Buddha himself had trance states. So 151, the right-hand column, significantly, the Buddha did not deny the possibility of such an experience of a total cessation of psychophysical processes. In fact, a famous account of his death reports that while giving his last sermon to his assembled disciples, he had a stomach pain, he went into a trance, and then he came back out of it refreshed. For Buddhists, on the other hand, it means only that under the right conditions, the flow of sensory experience can be temporarily frozen. There is for them no reason to jump to the conclusion that such a frozen state is more fundamental or truer than other states. For the Buddhist, it is noteworthy that such trance states and dreamless sleep are temporary events. Those purported experiences of eternity are themselves transient and temporary. Even in dreamless sleep or trance states, there is a continuity of some processes defining the self, the physical processes of the body, for example. Okay. So he says those purported experiences of eternity are themselves transient and temporary. But that doesn't mean, in my point of view, that just because our false egos that identify ourselves with the bodies can temporarily experience an eternal realm where the past, the present, and the future are experienced simultaneously, and then we fall out of that realization. That doesn't mean that that realization doesn't remain eternal. It just means that the temporary identifications of ourselves with our bodies can enter it and can fall back out of it. So the Buddhists would say there can be no frozen state where processes stop permanently, that these frozen states are themselves temporary. There's a lot of philosophical issues I could raise about that, but we're already an hour and 4 minutes. I'm trying to keep these video is under an hour and 20 minutes, so let me just conclude in the right-hand column. In summation, by rejecting the contemporaneous notion of atman, the early Indian Buddhist philosophers were not denying the existence of the self, but only insisting that there were logical, empirical, and meta-practical reasons for denying the self as a substantial, permanent, transcendent entity. The Buddhists certainly maintain that the self exists, but only as a name, like river or nature, for a set of interrelated processes. Okay, so now we're going to get into David Hume, who is not a Buddhist, but whose reasoning process was exactly, or almost exactly, what Buddhists prescribe to free ourselves from the anxiety that arises from these hankerings after illusions or delusions. It's an important distinction between illusion and delusion. The delusion of permanence. We want to be a permanent self. We want objects that endure for us to own, and all of these attachments lead to misery. Get rid of the attachments, your misery will go away. All right, I'm looking back here at Joel Kupperman's article, Hinduism and the Self, because he compares Buddhism to David Hume. So on page 135, he says, we could look inside ourselves, that is, for something that looks like a me, tracking then as a stable element in our experience. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume tries this experiment and came up empty. He tried that experiment. This led him in Book 1 of the Treatise of Human Nature to deny that any of us has a self, at least in the sense of a stable and changing element of our minds. More than 2,000 years earlier, Buddha, reacting against a philosophical tradition that provided the base for what became known as Hinduism, tried the same experiment with the same result. Okay, and then he mentions Hume again. Let me just see if I can find where he does that. But at any rate, it's well known. David Hume's philosophy is very similar to the Buddhist philosophy. So if you had some trouble understanding the Buddhist interpretation provided by Thomas Kasulis and me, maybe David Hume will help you understand what they're talking about a little more clearly. So David Hume, Scottish empiricist, a treatise of human nature written in 1738. So I'm going to read just bits and pieces, and let's see where we go with this. So, of personal identity. Page 152, the left-hand column. There are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration both of its perfect identity and simplicity. Identity means it's the same from one moment to the next. Simplicity means it's not compounded of other things. It's its own indivisible unit. Plato said that. René Descartes said that. Leibniz said that. Atman, the Hindus, that's what Atman is supposed to be. It's a point of eternal. Now, the Shankara said it dissolves in a Brahman, but the theistic Hindus, who should have been represented here, I think, to contrast them to the Buddhists, say it's this eternal point of subjective consciousness. Unluckily, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them. Nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is here explained. For from what impression could this idea be derived? He's an empiricist. He says, what sense impression? Knowledge must come from sense impressions. Every idea of a real thing must be connected to some sense impression, a sight, a sound, a taste, a touch, a smell. So if it's not, then it's not real. And furthermore, even if we could find a sense impression connected to the idea of a self, that sense impression would have to be continuous and unchanging for it to represent the self. And we don't have that experience, he will say. So it must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. I'm the same self throughout my life? Oh, really? Says Hume. But there is no impression, constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. Okay. if they did exist all at the same time, suddenly you've got evidence for a self, according to Hume's reasoning, and I will submit to you that the past, the present, and the future of every pain, pleasure, grief, and joy and passion you've ever experienced is recorded at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, which the Hindus call Akasha, and that people have experienced that. At what point in time? During near-death experiences, for example, when their hearts stop and their consciousnesses rise out of their bodies and hurtle through space-time towards the horizon of the cosmos. If those near-death experience accounts are accurate, and Plato depicted one in the myth of Ur, as I've talked about earlier at the end of the Republic, the Katha Upanishad is a near-death experience, and not only near-death experiences, but trance states through meditation, through psychedelic drugs. Many different avenues have led towards this realization of this horizon of the cosmos as the Akashic record, as the memory bank of the universe, where you can experience everything that ever happened or will happen in the universe simultaneously. That's what a self must be, according to Hume. That's what a self is, according to Plato and theistic schools of Hinduism. Continuing with David Hume, and that's why I really like David Hume. He says, this is what you need to have if you want to have what you call an enduring self. Now, this seems impossible, so there is no self. I've never experienced it, but I like the way he delineated the requirements. From his perspective, these are impossible requirements, so he wasn't shy about saying, well, if you could do that, then you'd have a self on your hands. And then along comes another atheist. I don't know if David Hume was an atheist, but at any rate, Leonard Susskind claims to be, even though he hems and haws on that sometimes in interviews that I've watched. But he gave us this memory bank of the universe, which is the cutting edge of physics and academia today, and that would fulfill the requirements of a self that David Hume lays down. But further, continuing with David Hume, what must become of all our particular perceptions upon this hypothesis? All these are different and distinguishable and separable from each other, and may be separately considered, and may exist separately, and have no need of anything to support their existence. The fact that you had a sense impression doesn't mean it needs to be imprinted on some substance that's having that experience. The sense impression is what it is. It's a sense impression. After what manner, therefore, do they belong to the self, and how are they connected with it? For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long am I insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. Nor do I conceive what is further requisite to make me a perfect non-entity. If anyone upon serious and unprejudiced reflection thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thoughts are still more variable than our sight. It's like a theater. Our mind, ideas come in, they go, they re-enter in an infinite variety of configurations, and even the theater's not a good metaphor, he says, because that implies some structure that endures through space and time. There isn't any stage upon which these sense perceptions come and go. All there are these perceptions and memories and unconnected individual experiences is what we actually experience. Again, Kant said, yes, that's empirical apperception. It's the sixth sense that the Hindus and Buddhists talk about, introspection. And Buddha said, look, I'm introspectively observing what's going on. There's no self anywhere. Even under the Bodhi tree, when he achieved enlightenment and he went out to the outermost summit of the universe, he says, I see no self anywhere. But that summit of the universe is itself the self from which he was perceiving, if we pay attention to the Upanishads. That there is such a place from which you can perceive the entire universe from one glance would imply that that place is that ground that's unperceivable directly, that it's the ground of perception itself. That's obviously my belief, and again, I'll always say, I'm not trying to hide what my beliefs are. What's the point? It's almost impossible. But you don't have to agree with my beliefs in any way at all. You can totally disagree. You can even overtly say, Professor Desmond, I absolutely disagree with what you've said. I believe I agree with Hume and Buddha, and this is why. And if you support what you've said with pertinent quotes from the text, you'll get an A, guaranteed. Okay, so Hume is saying, I don't see it. That's all there is this flux. What then gives us so great a propensity to ascribe an identity to these successive perceptions and to suppose ourselves possessed of an invariable and uninterrupted existence through the whole course of our lives? And he says it's because we mix up in our minds the categories of identity and diversity. So we know what it means for one thing to be the same from one moment to the next. And we know what diversity means. Things change. But if things change gradually enough, then we mistake that gradual change for identity. And he says, for example, vegetables and animals, they obviously change from a tree, from an acorn to a huge oak tree. It's completely changed. And with animals, the human body included, you drink and you eat and then you expel the waste. After a certain amount of time, there's not a single atom in your body that was there 7 years earlier. So yet you call it, it's my body, but your body's constantly changing. So it's not the same body as it was when you were, a child. It's not the same body as it was at any moment. It's constantly changing, just like a river. But because the change is gradual, we mistake it for an unchanging thing. And, and the same with a tree. It's always constantly changing, but we use the word tree. It's the same thing, because why? We use the same word to it. And we make the same mistake about our own minds. What do we don't have the same thoughts in our minds from one moment to the next. They're always changing ever so slightly, if not radically. And so what gives us this illusion of an enduring self? For one thing, the ideas happen with such rapidity that it seems like one continuous stream of consciousness, like a movie. Still frames unfolding in front of a projector light give the illusion of a flow of movement, one continuous flow. So that's one of the reasons we get duped into mistaking this flux of sense perceptions and emotions for a continuous self, is that the rapidity of it deludes us into this idea of a continuous flow. And another reason is the idea of cause and effect, which gets a little more detailed. Okay, we have in our memory, even if we acknowledge, all of our experiences are separate. I mean, we change over time, but the changes are connected by the causal link, by cause and effect. This event caused that event, which caused that event, which caused that event. So even though the events have come and they've gone, they remain connected by the series of links of cause and effect. And what Hume will say is, I don't see any cause and effect when we went over knowledge. This was a big point. You believe in the laws of nature because you believe in the laws of cause and effect. You've seen one event happen and it's always followed by another event. And so you assume the first event caused the other event to happen. But you don't actually see anything called cause. You don't see an actual little link of a chain causing the other thing. That is a habit of the human mind, says Hume, that we insert into this repeating events. And we assume that they must always happen that way in the future. We've seen it happen this way in the past, therefore we assume it must always happen that way in the future. But that's not the case. We can have no absolute certain knowledge. It probably will unfold that way in the future if it's always unfolded that way in the past, but we can't be absolutely certain. Kant said, yes, we can, because the laws of cause and effect aren't fictions that we foist upon the flux of phenomena. It is one of the a priori categories of thought that we automatically insert, or through which our sense perceptions are automatically organized for us. And what nature is simply what we perceive. And what we perceive is a world entirely ordered by our categories of thought, and we can be certain that our perceptions of the universe will follow these orderly principles absolutely, unfailingly, because the ordering principles are only describing the psychological processes of our own mind. And it's not such a ridiculous thing to say that you can understand how your own mind works. That's what Kant would say, that this empirical apperception that Hume used, I don't perceive a self in any of my sense perceptions and memories and emotions, that will never work. But your reason can realize you would never have had these types of sense impressions organized for you the way they are, and to the illusion of enduring objects connected by cause and effect. That's not something you could just habitually start accidentally perceiving. It's a consequence of the objectively real psychological lenses of cognition, which couldn't exist unless they were connected to something objectively real, a self. You can't observe it directly, but it is real. You can understand that through transcendental apperception. So I've gone over that a few times. So we've gone over an hour and 20 minutes, but I'm going to just continue a little bit longer to finish with David Hume, because there's only a little bit more. So he gives various examples of why we insert this fiction of a continuously enduring object onto objects that are obviously always changing. They change gradually. A ship, if it's, bits and pieces of it are replaced continuously, it can have not one single bit of timber on it that it originally had, and yet you still call it the same ship. A church, another example that he used, I think, elsewhere, that burns down, a wooden church that burns down and that is rebuilt in brick is still called the same church because it houses the same congregation. And even though that congregation is continuously changing, because there's been this continuity, you call it the same church. So it's really a linguistic problem. We saw the Buddhists say the same thing. Yeah, there's a self. It's just a word, and it's a word that applies to a series of processes that are somehow linked together. Now, I mentioned then the idea of these processes being linked together. Hume won't even grant that. There are no links. You don't perceive links. You perceive unconnected, discrete sense impressions and memories and emotions. You don't perceive a process. It's just a flux. The Buddhists, or at least the way that Thomas Kasulis was saying, was that the self is this nexus of processes that are linked together. So that is, I don't know if he misused the word linked. At any rate, this is what I'm going to continue here with David Hume. He says, the identity, on page 154, the right-hand column, the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. It cannot, therefore, have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. I'm going to continue here. All right, I underline this, the right-hand column, 154 at the bottom. But as notwithstanding this distinction and separability of all of our sense perceptions, we suppose the whole train of perceptions to be united by identity. A question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity, whether it is something that really binds our several perceptions together or only associates their ideas in the imagination. That is, in other words, whether in pronouncing concerning the identity of a person, we observe some real bond among his perceptions, or only feel one among the ideas we form of them. This question we might easily decide if we would recollect what has been already proved at large, namely, that the understanding never observes any real connection among objects. and that even the union of cause and effect, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. For from this it evidently follows that identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together, but rather is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of their ideas in the imagination when we reflect upon them. And here it is evident we must confine ourselves to resemblance and causation, as memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions. It is to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. Memory is the source of personal identity. Why? Because had we no memory, we never should have any notion of causation, nor consequently of that chain of causes and effects which constitute our self or person. And then he talks about, if you are your memory, as John Locke said, and I'll say in the next video, well, that implies yourself flashes in and out of existence because your memory of the past flashes in and out of existence. He says, who of us remembers where we were on January 1715, the 1st of January 1715, the 11th of March 1719, the 3rd of August 1733? All right, it will be incumbent upon those who affirm that memory produces entirely our personal identity to give a reason why we can thus extend our identity beyond our memory. Nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. This is what he says. This is what the Buddhists say. Identity depends on the relations of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. A bunch of unconnected sense perceptions in memory, these relations of ideas enable us to swiftly purvey them, and it provides the illusion of a continuously real thing. But as the relations and the easiness of the transition may diminish by insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose a title to the name of identity. And here's his concluding sentence: all the disputes concerning the identity of connected objects are merely verbal, except so far as the relation of parts give rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed. So, David Hume, like the Buddhists, he says, what is a self? It's a word. And the whole idea of a self is a result of the grammatical preconceptions that are attached to how we use words. Everything must have a cause. Therefore, there's cause and effect, and my memories, I don't remember them all, but I can remember them occasionally, but I know they're all continuously existing and connected because they're connected by an underlying chain of causes and effects, if by nothing else. Even if I don't perceive every memory simultaneously, which would really grant the existence of a self as being perfect, having perfect identity and simplicity. That's atman. Perfect identity, it's always the same unchangingly from one point of time to the next. And simplicity, it's not extended in space. It's not assembled of parts. It's its own simple thing. Even if I don't have that, some might say, I am still a self who continuously exists because I've got all these memories of everything I did, and they're connected by the chain of cause and effect. Hume says there's no chain of cause and effect. You insert that. There's unconnected sense impressions and emotions and ideas, and then we insert these relationships between them. But those relationships are imaginary, and they're a result of grammatical confusion. And that is also what we saw at the end of Thomas Kasulis' article. The Buddhist certainly maintains that the self exists, but only as a name, like a river or nature, for a set of interrelated processes. Okay, so I will leave it at that.